You find yourself standing in the grand throne room of the Louvre Palace on a crisp autumn morning in the 1396. The air is thick with incense and political tension, as French courtiers whisper in hushed tones about the most audacious diplomatic gamble in European history. Through the tall windows, you can see the Seine flowing past, carrying with it the hopes and fears of two kingdoms that have been locked in bitter warfare for nearly 60 years. In just a few months, a child who has barely learned to read will become the Queen of England, married to a king old enough to be her father. This is the story of Isabella of Valois, a 6-year-old princess who would become the center of medieval Europe's most controversial royal marriage. Before we dive into this forgotten chapter of medieval politics, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These tales of power, survival, and human resilience deserve to be remembered, and your support helps bring these incredible stories to light. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It's amazing that we can explore these ancient dramas together, connected across centuries by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II was never meant to be a love story. It was a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy, a living treaty designed to end one of history's most devastating conflicts. But to understand why a 6-year-old girl became the key to peace between England and France, we need to step back and examine the world that created this extraordinary situation. The year 1396 marked a turning point in what historians would later call the 100 Years' War. For 6 decades, England and France had been locked in a brutal struggle that had consumed entire generations. English armies had ravaged French countryside, while French forces had threatened English coastal towns. The war had evolved from a simple succession dispute into something far more complex, a clash of emerging national identities that had left both kingdoms exhausted and desperate for peace. Isabella was born into this world of constant warfare on November 9, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the eldest daughter of one of medieval Europe's most troubled monarchs, Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad. Her father's mental illness would cast a long shadow over Isabella's childhood, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that would prepare her, in ways no child should be prepared, for the political upheavals that lay ahead. Picture young Isabella's daily life in the opulent but unstable French court. One morning she might find her father bouncing her on his knee, showering her with gifts and attention, his eyes bright with paternal love. The next day, she might discover him cowering in a corner of the palace, screaming that assassins were coming to kill him, or standing motionless for hours, convinced that his body was made of glass and would shatter if he moved. Palace servants would quickly usher the children away during these episodes, but the confusion and terror lingered in Isabella's dark eyes. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was a formidable woman trying to hold the kingdom together during her husband's periods of madness. Beautiful, intelligent, and ruthlessly pragmatic, Isabeau understood better than most that royal children were valuable assets in the complex game of European politics. She watched her eldest daughter with calculating eyes, knowing that Isabella's beauty and royal blood would one day secure a crucial alliance for France. The question was not whether Isabella would be married for political purposes, but when and to whom. The French court of Isabella's childhood was a place of extraordinary luxury and constant danger. The palace walls were decorated with tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love and chivalric romance, but the reality was far harsher. Nobles schemed against each other in gilded chambers, while servants whispered about which faction was gaining or losing influence. Young Isabella learned to read faces and moods before she could properly read books, developing the kind of political instincts that would serve her well in the years to come. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, King Richard II was facing his own set of challenges. At 29, He had ruled England for nearly 2 decades, but his reign had been marked by constant conflict with his nobility and ongoing military campaigns in France. Richard was an educated, cultured man who preferred art and literature to warfare, but the demands of kingship in the 14th century required him to be both diplomat and warrior. The death of Richard's beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, in 1394, had left him devastated and without an heir. Anne had been known as Good Queen Anne, beloved by the English people for her gentleness and charity. Her death from plague had not only broken Richard's heart, but also created a dangerous political vacuum. A king without a wife and heir was vulnerable to challenges from ambitious nobles who might see an opportunity to advance their own claims to the throne. Richard's advisors urged him to remarry quickly, but the English king was initially resistant. His marriage to Anne had been one of genuine affection, a rarity among royal unions of the time. The thought of replacing her felt like a betrayal of her memory. But duty to the realm ultimately outweighed personal sentiment, and when French ambassadors arrived with a proposal that could end the war, Richard began to listen with growing interest. The French proposition was audacious in its scope and revolutionary in its implications. They offered not just the hand of the king's eldest daughter, but a dowry of 800,000 francs, an astronomical sum that would go far toward refilling England's war-depleted treasury. More importantly, they offered a 28-year truce, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without knowing the horrors of war between the two kingdoms. There was, however, one significant obstacle that would make this marriage unlike any other in European history. Isabella was only 6 years old, extraordinarily young even by medieval standards where political marriages typically involved girls who were at least approaching adolescence. Most royal brides of the era were between 12 and 16, old enough to understand their role and eventually fulfill their primary duty of producing heirs. The French negotiators argued that Isabella's very youth was actually an advantage. The marriage would symbolize a completely new beginning, untainted by the hatred and bloodshed that had characterized relations between the two kingdoms for so long. Isabella would be raised at the English court, learning English customs, language, and loyalties. By the time she was old enough to rule as queen consort, she would be as much English as French, a living bridge between two peoples who had been enemies for longer than anyone could remember. Richard's counsellors were deeply divided about the proposal. Some saw the wisdom in the arrangement, pointing out that the dowry alone would fund the royal household for years, while the extended truce would allow England to focus on other pressing concerns, particularly the growing threat from Scotland and ongoing rebellions in Ireland. The prospect of peace with France was almost too good to believe after decades of devastating warfare. Others worried about the unprecedented nature of marrying such a young child, fearing it would scandalize even the medieval nobility, who were accustomed to political marriages, but had never seen anything quite like this. There were also concerns about the long-term implications of the arrangement. What would happen if Isabella died before reaching maturity? What if she proved unable to bear children? What if the political situation in France changed dramatically before she came of age? But Richard himself was intrigued by something that transcended mere political calculation. Court observers noted that when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella sent by the French ambassadors, something in his expression softened. Here was a child who would need protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps, some whispered, the childless king saw in this arrangement not just a political alliance, but the opportunity to be a father figure as well as a husband. The negotiations stretched on for months, with ambassadors crossing the treacherous waters of the English Channel repeatedly to hammer out the intricate details of this unprecedented union. Every aspect of Isabella's future life was debated and codified in legal documents that would govern her existence for years to come. She would retain her French servants and ladies-in-waiting, at least initially. She would be allowed to practice French customs and maintain regular correspondence with her family. Most crucially, all parties agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity, a protection that was written explicitly into the treaty. Meanwhile, in the luxurious chambers of the Louvre Palace, 6-year-old Isabella continued to play with her dolls and practice her letters, blissfully unaware that her fate was being decided in council chambers and written into documents sealed with wax and ribbon. Her tutors began teaching her basic English phrases, and seamstresses started work on a trousseau fit for a queen. She was told she was going to marry a great king across the water, but at 6 years old, the concept was no more real to her than the fairy tales her nurses told at bedtime. The world was about to change forever for this little girl, but she had no way of understanding the magnitude of what lay ahead. Soon, she would leave everything familiar behind and step into a role that would test every ounce of courage and intelligence she possessed. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II would become one of the most extraordinary stories in medieval history, a tale of survival, politics, and the terrible price of peace. The wedding ceremony itself took place not once, but twice, reflecting the complex diplomatic choreography required for such an unprecedented union. The first ceremony was held on October 31st, 1396, at the English-controlled port of Calais, neutral ground that belonged to England but sat on French soil. This intimate affair was attended primarily by high-ranking negotiators and nobles from both kingdoms, men who understood that they were witnessing not just a marriage, but the signing of a living treaty. Standing in the great hall of Calais Castle, Isabella must have been overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment that she could barely comprehend. She wore a gown of cloth of gold, so heavy with embroidery and pearls that she needed assistance walking down the aisle. The weight of the fabric seemed to mirror the weight of expectations, now resting on her tiny shoulders. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, and witnesses noted how gently he lifted her chin when she seemed frightened by the assembled nobles staring at her with calculating eyes. The ceremony was conducted in both French and English, with interpreters ensuring that every word was understood by both parties. When the priest asked if Isabella took Richard to be her husband, her small voice could barely be heard above the shuffling of feet and rustling of silk. Richard's response was firm and clear, his voice carrying the authority of a king but tempered with surprising gentleness as he looked down at his child bride. The second ceremony took place nearly a year later, when Isabella was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. This was the grand spectacle designed to show the English people and foreign observers that this unusual marriage had the full support of the crown. The crowds that gathered in London were unprecedented, with several people reportedly dying in the crush to catch a glimpse of the famous young queen who had captured the imagination of Europe. Isabella processed through London's narrow streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleurs-de-lis, symbols carefully chosen to represent the union of two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, its weight distributed carefully so it wouldn't cause her discomfort during the long ceremony. Her train was carried by English duchesses who had been chosen not just for their rank, but for their ability to serve as guardians and teachers to this foreign child who was now their queen. The coronation feast lasted 3 days, with entertainment that included jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations depicting the glorious future this marriage would bring to both kingdoms. Isabella sat at the high table beside Richard, carefully picking at her food with the precise manners her French tutors had drilled into her, while English nobles raised their cups in toast after toast to the health of their new child queen. But even as the celebrations continued, experienced courtiers were already beginning to whisper about the challenges that lay ahead. Medieval truces, no matter how elaborately negotiated, were fragile things that could shatter at the first sign of political instability. Richard II, despite his current power, was not universally beloved by his English nobles. There were murmurs of discontent, particularly among those who felt the king was too influenced by his court favourites and too willing to make peace with France when England's military position remained strong. For the moment, however, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, a suite of rooms that had been specially prepared for her arrival. The chambers were decorated in a style that blended French and English tastes, with tapestries depicting scenes from both kingdoms' histories and furnishings that would make her feel welcomed rather than imprisoned. Her household was carefully chosen to provide both comfort and education. French ladies-in-waiting remained with her to ease the transition, while English attendants were selected not just for their loyalty to the crown, but for their ability to teach Isabella the complex etiquette of English court life. She had her own chaplain, her own tutors, and her own servants, creating a miniature French court within the heart of the English palace. Richard himself took an active and surprisingly personal interest in Isabella's education and welfare. Contemporary chronicles describe him visiting her apartments regularly, often bringing gifts that revealed his thoughtful attention to her needs and interests. He brought her exotic birds from Ireland, their bright plumage delighting a child who had never seen such creatures. He commissioned fine books from Oxford scholars, volumes illuminated with beautiful pictures that would help her learn to read English while enjoying stories of knights and princesses. Musical instruments crafted by London's finest artisans appeared in her chambers, and Isabella showed a natural aptitude for the lute and the psaltery. Richard would sometimes sit with her during these music lessons, his own love of the arts evident in the way he encouraged her developing talents. These moments of genuine connection helped transform what could have been a purely political arrangement into something approaching a real relationship between guardian and ward. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own, though her unique position as queen set her apart in ways that sometimes confused and isolated her. Medieval royal households typically included numerous young nobles being raised and educated alongside the monarch's own family, and Isabella found herself navigating complex social hierarchies that even adults struggled to understand. Her closest companion became Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers and only 2 years older than Isabella. Margaret seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen, serving as both friend and guide to the intricate world of English noble society. It was Margaret who taught Isabella the English children's games, who helped her understand which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with secrets, and who warned her about the political undercurrents that even children couldn't entirely escape. The two girls would spend hours in Isabella's private garden, a walled space where she could play without the constant observation of the court. Here, practicing their needlework under the watchful eyes of their governesses, Margaret would explain the genealogies of English noble houses and the ancient feuds that still simmered beneath the surface of court politeness. Isabella proved to be a quick learner, and her French perspective on English politics often provided insights that surprised her older companions. During one of these afternoon conversations, Isabella asked Margaret a question that revealed her growing understanding of her precarious position. Why do the English nobles seem to watch each other so carefully? In France, there are factions and quarrels, but here, everyone seems to be waiting for something to happen. Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Richard's reign had been marked by conflicts with his nobles almost from the beginning. There had been a major rebellion when he was young, and he had never entirely forgiven those who had opposed him. Meanwhile, many of the great lords believed Richard was too fond of his court favourites and too willing to ignore their counsel on matters of war and governance. "The king is powerful now," Margaret said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "But power in England must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him, because it brings peace with France, but some think it shows weakness, that he prefers negotiation to conquest. Isabella absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that her life was connected to forces much larger than herself. She began to watch the interactions at court with new eyes, noticing how certain nobles would fall silent when Richard entered a room, how conversations would shift when she appeared, how even her French ladies-in-waiting seemed to choose their words carefully when discussing political matters. The years 1397 and 1398 passed peacefully for Isabella, allowing her to grow from a frightened child into a more confident girl. Her English became fluent, losing most of its French accent, and her understanding of court life grew more sophisticated with each passing month. The massive stone walls of Westminster became familiar rather than intimidating, and she could navigate the complex maze of corridors and chambers without getting lost. Her education expanded far beyond the typical feminine accomplishments of needlework and music. Richard insisted that she learn to read and write in both French and English, and her tutors included some of the finest scholars in the kingdom. She studied history, particularly the chronicles of English and French kings, learning about the great figures whose actions had shaped the world she now inhabited. One of her favorite lessons involved maps, great parchments that her tutor, Master William, would spread across the floor of her study chamber. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing coastlines with her finger, and learning about the geography that had influenced centuries of conflict between her birth country and her adopted home. "See here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This small strip of water has been both bridge and barrier between our peoples. Your marriage represents the hope that it might finally serve only as a bridge." Isabella nodded solemnly, understanding even at 9 years old that she embodied something larger than herself. She was not just a girl learning to be a queen. She was a living symbol of peace between two nations that had been enemies for longer than anyone could remember. But symbols, as Isabella was about to learn, could be fragile things in the violent world of medieval politics. The first signs of trouble came in early 1399, when Isabella noticed changes in the atmosphere at court. Conversations stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Even Margaret Holland seemed distracted and anxious, though she tried to maintain their usual routines. Richard himself seemed different during his visits to Isabella's apartments. The gifts ceased, and when he did come, he appeared preoccupied, sometimes staring out the windows toward the Thames, as if expecting to see ships on the horizon. His usual warmth was replaced by a distant concern that Isabella found deeply unsettling. The truth was far more serious than a child's transgression. Richard was facing the greatest crisis of his reign, and it had nothing to do with his young queen. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army. The English nobles, many of whom had long chafed under Richard's rule, began flocking to Henry's banner with alarming speed. Isabella first realized the severity of the situation when she woke one morning to find that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had disappeared during the night. When she asked her French attendants where they had gone, she received only evasive answers. By afternoon, she could hear shouting from the courtyard below her windows, and when she looked out, she saw armed men wearing unfamiliar colors. Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers that evening, her face pale with fear. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently. "Only the most essential things. We're leaving Westminster tonight." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her heart beginning to race with panic. "To the Tower," Margaret replied, and Isabella understood immediately. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in times of political upheaval, the distinction often became meaningless. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything in Isabella's previous experience. Instead of ceremonial processions, they travelled in a small, heavily guarded convoy. The curtains of her litter were drawn, but she could hear the sounds of the city around them, not the usual noise of commerce and daily life, but something more urgent and threatening. At the tower, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable but clearly designed to contain rather than simply house their occupant. The windows were barred and guards stood at every entrance. For the first time since arriving in England, Isabella felt truly isolated and afraid. Richard came to see her on her second day at the tower, and the change in him was shocking. The confident, kindly king she had known was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her father's episodes of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair, as he had done during their first meeting years ago. "I'm afraid our circumstances have become very difficult. There are those who question my right to rule, who seek to overturn the peace we have built with your father's kingdom." Isabella, now 10 years old and far more sophisticated than she had been 4 years earlier, understood the implications immediately. "Are you still king?" she asked directly. Richard's smile was bitter. "For now. But Henry Bolingbroke has many supporters, and I may not be able to protect you as I once could." Within weeks, Richard was dead, murdered in his cell at Pontefract Castle. Henry IV now wore the crown of England, and Isabella found herself a 10-year-old widow, valuable as a political asset but dangerous as a symbol of the old regime. The new king offered her a choice that was no choice at all. She could return to France, acknowledging his legitimacy and renouncing any claims to the English throne, or she could remain in England indefinitely as his prisoner. Isabella, displaying wisdom beyond her years, chose exile over captivity. Her departure from England in 1401 marked the end of one of medieval Europe's most extraordinary experiments in diplomatic marriage. The child who had been meant to bridge two kingdoms returned to France as a young woman shaped by experiences that few could understand. She had learned that even the most carefully crafted political arrangements could crumble overnight, that royal marriages were as fragile as the regimes that created them. Isabella would remarry, this time to her cousin Charles of Orleans, and find genuine happiness in a union based on affection rather than pure political calculation. But she would never forget her years as the child Queen of England, when she had embodied the hopes of two nations and learned the terrible price that peace could demand from those chosen to secure it. Her story reminds us that behind every grand political gesture, every treaty sealed with marriage, stood real human beings whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. Isabella of Valois survived because she learned to adapt, to find strength in impossible circumstances, and to never lose sight of her own humanity, even when the world around her treated her as nothing more than a valuable piece on the chessboard of medieval politics.